In 1823, near the Grand River in present-day South Dakota, American frontiersman Hugh Glass was brutally mauled by a grizzly bear, leaving him with a broken leg, a torn scalp exposing his skull, and deep claw wounds across his back and throat. Believing he would certainly die, two fellow trappers assigned to watch him abandoned him and stole his weapons and supplies. But against all odds, Glass miraculously survived. With no gear and barely able to move, he set his own broken leg and began dragging himself across the wilderness while tracking down the men who had betrayed him. To prevent infection, he reportedly let maggots consume the dead flesh in his wounds, survived on berries and roots, and once scared wolves off a bison carcass so he could eat it. After crawling roughly 200 miles through the frontier, Glass reached Fort Kiowa on the Missouri River, completing one of the most legendary survival stories in American history and inspiring the Revenant. For nearly 6 years, a woman named Lydia Abate has searched obituaries to find recently deceased people and contacted their families offering free estate cleanouts. In exchange, she requests to keep the vintage clothing left behind by the deceased. By collecting garments from the estates of people who have died, Abate has built an entire wardrobe and said she hasn't had to buy clothes in years. In 1998, during an Olympic Airways flight from Athens to New York City, a passenger suffered a severe asthma attack after being seated near the smoking section. His wife repeatedly asked a flight attendant to move him away from the cigarette smoke, but she was first told there were no empty seats and later that the crew was too busy. The man's condition worsened during the flight and he later died from the attack. His widow sued the airline and was eventually awarded about $1.4 million in damages.
How our legal system.
That was the moment a father snapped in court after learning how Larry Nassar had abused all three of his daughters. During a 2018 sentencing hearing in Charlotte, Randall Margrave suddenly lunged at Nassar after being denied his request to have 5 minutes alone with him. His daughters had each been abused under the guise of treatment, part of a disturbing pattern that spanned years and targeted hundreds of young female athletes. For decades, Nassar had been a trusted doctor for USA Gymnastics and Michigan State University, treating many elite athletes including Olympians. But behind that reputation, he was sexually abusing girls during supposed medical procedures, often without gloves and sometimes even with parents in the room convincing them it was necessary. Complaints dated back to the 1990s, but institutions repeatedly failed to act. It wasn't until 2016, when multiple women came forward publicly, that the full scale of the disgusting abuse was finally exposed. More than 250 victims eventually gave statements describing years of manipulation and sexual assault. In 2018, Nassar was sentenced to up to 175 years in prison. The case exposed massive institutional failures, led to high-level resignations, and resulted in hundreds of millions of dollars in settlements for victims. In July of 2023, while incarcerated at a penitentiary in Florida, Nassar was stabbed multiple times by another inmate during an altercation, suffering serious injuries including a collapsed lung, but survived after being hospitalized. The disgusting little rat will remain in prison for the rest of his life. Gabriela Martins Santos de Moura was a 31-year-old well-being influencer from Brazil who'd spent years trying to get pregnant with her husband. In February of 2026, she went to a human reproduction clinic in Sao Paulo to undergo an assisted fertility procedure as part of that effort. But during the treatment, she suddenly suffered cardiorespiratory arrest at the clinic. She was rushed to a hospital and placed on life support in intensive care. Her doctors fought to stabilize her for 8 days before confirming brain death. The exact complication that caused the cardiac arrest has not been publicly disclosed. The tragedy came just 1 day after she and her husband had celebrated their 8th wedding anniversary. After her death, her family announced they would donate her organ to give others the chance to live. In the summer of 1983, 53-year-old Silvano from a noble Venetian family died in Bologna, Italy, after developing one of the strangest and most terrifying inherited diseases ever documented, fatal familial insomnia. The illness began in middle age and slowly destroyed the part of his brain responsible for sleep, until Silvano gradually lost the ability to sleep at all. Days turned into weeks without rest as his body deteriorated, his brain slipping into delusions and hallucinations as doctors watched helplessly. The disease literally ate away at his brain tissue, and within a few months, the total absence of sleep led to organ failure and death. Here's an insane video taken by a museum visitor showing the incredible detail in a painting from the 1600s. The artwork is cognoscenti in a room hung with pictures, painted around 1620 by Flemish artists Willem van Heekt and Jan Bruegel the Younger. Scenes like this were known as gallery painting, a genre that depicted wealthy collectors showing off rooms packed with artworks, sculptures, and curiosities. Many of the tiny paintings shown inside the scene are actually real masterpieces of the time, carefully recreated in miniature fashion. Here's a photo of mummified crocodiles in the Egyptian Museum, a practice that dates back more than 2,000 years in ancient Egypt. Crocodiles were associated with the crocodile-headed god Sobek, who was believed to control the power of the Nile and protect people from its dangers. In temples dedicated to Sobek, crocodiles were sometimes raised in sacred pools, adorned with jewelry, and treated as living embodiments of the god. When they died, priests carefully mummified them using linen wrappings and resins, just like they did to humans. Thousands of crocodile mummies have been discovered in Egypt, including entire burial caches filled with both adult crocodiles and hatchlings, which were likely offered as religious sacrifices to the god. This was the final note written by Marie Antoinette at 4:30 a.m. on October 16, 1793, just hours before she was executed in Paris, France during the French Revolution. Addressed to her sister-in-law, Madame Elizabeth, from her cell, the letter includes the lines, "My lord, have pity on me. My eyes have no more tears to cry for you, my poor children. Farewell, farewell." Later that morning, Marie Antoinette was taken through the streets of Paris and executed by guillotine at the age of 37.
Gerechtigheid dient te worden op.
That was the moment a grieving father threw a chair at a judge inside a Dutch courtroom after hearing the sentence for the man responsible for killing his family members. In 2013, a speeding driver lost control of his car in Mayol, Netherlands, striking and killing a 2-year-old girl and her grandparents as they rode bicycles. The driver was initially sentenced to just 120 hours of community service and a 1-year suspended license, a ruling that sparked outrage in the courtroom. Prosecutors later appealed, and the sentence was increased to 15 months in prison and a 4-year driving ban. Elderly Englishman Stan Beaton kept a voicemail greeting recorded years earlier that included the voice of his wife Ruby, who died of cancer in 2003. For more than a decade, he would play the message almost every day just to hear her voice again. When a telecommunications system upgrade accidentally deleted the recording, engineers at the phone company spent several days searching archive servers until they were finally able to recover it. When the message was played for him again during a BBC interview, Beaton broke down in tears after hearing his wife's voice for the first time since it was lost. This video shows a dolphin playing with a pufferfish, nudging and rolling it around in the water. When threatened, pufferfish release a powerful tetrodotoxin, deadly in high doses but may produce a mild narcotic effect in small amounts. Researchers believe dolphins sometimes provoke the fish just enough to trigger a small release of the toxin before lingering near the surface in a calm, almost trance-like state, highlighting the high intelligence of these creatures and how this intoxication-seeking behavior appears strikingly similar to humans. This cat seems to know exactly how to get its owner's attention, using the door knocker knowing that it's loud enough for the person inside to hear. For the first time on record, scientists documented a wild orangutan deliberately treating his own injury using a medicinal plant. In 2022, a male orangutan named Rakis was observed with an open facial wound, after which he selected leaves from a plant known for its anti-inflammatory properties, chewed them into a pulp, and carefully applied the juice directly onto the wound. He then pressed the leftover plant matter over the injury, effectively forming a crude bandage. Researchers noted the wound healed perfectly without signs of infection, marking the first confirmed case of a wild non-human animal independently performing a multi-step medical treatment on itself. Before he became Wolverine, Hugh Jackman was a struggling actor working kids' birthday parties as a clown named Coco, earning about $50 a gig. He's admitted he didn't even know any real magic tricks and was once told by a 6-year-old, "You're terrible." Jackman has said those early performances forced him to learn how to command a room, handle rejection, and keep entertaining no matter what, skills that would later define his stage and film career. In 1946, French designer Louis Réard named the bikini after Bikini Atoll, where the United States had just conducted atomic bomb tests. He chose the name deliberately, claiming the revealing swimsuit would have an explosive cultural impact similar to the atomic blast that had just shocked the world. Sylvester Stallone wrote the script for Rocky in about 3 days after watching underdog boxer Chuck Wepner go the distance with Muhammad Ali. At the time, Stallone was struggling financially and reportedly had less than $200 in his bank account. Studios offered to buy the script but wanted a major star in the lead role. Stallone refused any offers unless he could play Rocky himself. He took a significantly smaller payday to secure the role, a gamble that paid off when Rocky won the Academy Award for Best Picture and launched his career. In February of 2025, 17-year-old Sarah Grace Patrick allegedly shot and killed her parents to death while they slept inside their Georgia home. She initially called 911 and reported finding them dead, and in the months that followed, posted emotional TikTok videos mourning their deaths, even urging true crime creators to cover the case, calling it a really big hit. But 5 months later, investigators charged Sarah with 2 counts of murder, citing physical and digital evidence they said tied her to the killings. She turned herself in and was denied bond, as prosecutors described what they called mountains of evidence, while family members publicly maintained her innocence. In 1999, Japanese woman Namiko Takaba was found murdered inside the apartment she shared with her husband, Satoru. With no arrests and very few leads, the case went cold, but Satoru refused to let it fade. Convinced that future forensic technology would eventually expose the killer, he kept paying rent on the empty apartment for 26 years, preserving the crime scene exactly as it was. Bloodstains, footprints, and untouched evidence remained sealed inside, costing him roughly $145,000 over decades. But finally, in late 2025, advances in DNA analysis finally produced a match from the preserved blood evidence. The suspect was identified as a former high school classmate of Satoru, who allegedly harbored a long-standing grudge after he rejected her romantically. Confronted with the DNA evidence, she confessed after her arrest. In 2024, Toronto Blue Jays fan Liz McGuire was suddenly struck in the face by a 110-mile-per-hour foul ball off of Bo Bichette's bat after briefly looking away during a game, leaving her with ridiculously severe swelling and a black eye that later went viral online. She managed to avoid any major injuries, but another fan grabbed the ball that hit her and ran off. After she publicly asked the team to hook a girl up, the moment gained national attention. Cops produced 110 custom cards featuring her injury photo, and the Blue Jays later sent her a signed Bo Bichette baseball, tickets, and access to batting practice, turning a potentially life-threatening accident into one of baseball's best fan stories. In April of 2016, 11-year-old Chris Gaither of Talladega, Alabama, was home alone when a 30-year-old man broke in, reportedly armed and demanding money. That's when the boy grabbed a handgun and fired multiple rounds as the intruder moved through the house, striking him in the leg and forcing him to flee into nearby woods. Suspect was later captured and charged with burglary, among other offenses. No charges were filed against Gaither, and local authorities publicly stated he acted in self-defense. The case sparked national debate over gun access and child self-defense, while the intruder eventually recovered from his injuries while in custody. This innocent-looking photo was one of the last selfies taken of Chris Kremers and Lee Sanfroon on April 1, 2014, shortly before they vanished while hiking the El Pianista Trail in Panama. The photo was taken near the trail's end, where hikers are supposed to turn back, but for some reason, the two continued deeper into the jungle instead. In the days that followed, Froon's phone was repeatedly powered off and on as emergency calls were attempted. On the night of April 8th, her camera captured over 90 flash photos in total darkness. Among them is a disturbing close-up believed to show the back of Kremers' head with strands of hair lit up by the flash. It's unknown if either woman was alive by the time these photos were taken. Months later, their backpacks and skeletal remains were found scattered along the jungle, and the exact circumstances of their deaths remain unknown. In 2017, Brooke Preston was brutally killed inside her home by her longtime friend and roommate Randy Herman Jr. after he stabbed her 25 times. Herman admitted he carried out the attack, but claimed he was sleepwalking and had no memory of killing her. Investigators found no medical or behavioral evidence to support a sleepwalking episode, and prosecutors argued the number, placement, and force of the wounds showed conscious intent. The sleepwalking defense was ultimately rejected by the jury, who convicted Herman and sentenced him to prison for the rest of his life. Jordan James Park, the British influencer known as the Lip King, has died at age 34 after a suspected complication linked to a cosmetic procedure. Park gained notoriety for spending more than $150,000 on surgeries and even appeared on the reality show Botched, where doctors warned him about the risks tied to extreme fillers and repeated operations. Police are currently treating his death as unexplained, while a man and woman were arrested on suspicion of manslaughter as the investigation continues. The case has quickly sparked renewed discussion about the dangers of unregulated cosmetic work and the overwhelming pressure created by online beauty trends. In October of 2011, 2-year-old Wang Yu wandered into a market street in Foshan, China, where she was struck by a van and left critically injured in the road. Surveillance footage later showed dozens of pedestrians and drivers passing by without intervening before a second truck ran her over. After several minutes, a female waste collector finally moved her to safety, but the child tragically died a few hours later from her injuries. The case sparked worldwide debate about bystander transgender behavior, public responsibility, and the social pressures that may discourage people from intervening in emergencies. Daisy Coleman grew up in a family marked by repeated tragedy. In 2009, her father was killed when their car slipped on black ice and plunged into a ravine in Missouri. In 2012, at age 14, Daisy was sexually assaulted while incapacitated and left outside her home in freezing temperatures. Despite hospital records documenting injuries and extreme intoxication, the charges were later dropped, and she was publicly discredited, triggering years of vicious harassment. In 2013, the family's home burned down under mysterious circumstances, and in 2018, Daisy's younger brother Tristan died in a car crash, mirroring their father's death. By 2020, Daisy was struggling with severe PTSD, harassment, a reported stalker, and learning she couldn't have children, a condition doctors said may have been linked to the assault. Under the weight of it all, she took her own life that August at the young age of 23. 4 months later, her mother Melinda also died by suicide. Daisy's story was documented in Audrey and Daisy, released while she was still trying to rebuild her life. On Christmas Eve in 2008, 45-year-old Bruce Jeffrey Pardo arrived at his ex-wife's house in California wearing a Santa Claus suit and carrying multiple firearms. When the front door was opened by an 8-year-old girl, he shot her in the face before opening fire at a crowded family Christmas party. Bruce then unleashed a homemade fuel dispensing device hidden inside a wrapped present, igniting a massive fire that trapped victims inside as the house burned. 9 people were killed, some by gunfire, and others burned so badly that it took investigators several days to identify them. The fire burned so intensely that parts of Bruce's Santa suit melted onto his skin, forcing him to flee while still on fire. He later drove to his brother's house, where he turned the gun on himself. Investigators later determined the attack was driven by rage over a recent divorce, mounting financial pressure after losing his job, and a bitter custody dispute, with Bruce specifically targeting his ex-wife and her family. Police discovered that he'd spent months preparing, stockpiling weapons, booby-trapping vehicles with explosives, and compiling a list of additional targets, including his ex-wife's divorce attorney, making the attack one of the most disturbing holiday massacres in U.S. history. In 2020, Ohio College student Sidney Powell brutally murdered her mother Brenda Powell inside their home. Prosecutors say Sidney first struck her mother with a cast iron skillet before stabbing her more than 30 times in the neck. The attack happened while Brenda was on the phone with officials from the University of Mount Union, who were speaking with her about Sidney being dismissed from the school. According to investigators, Sidney had become enraged over being kicked out of college and feared her mother would cut off financial support and force her to face consequences. As the call continued, university staff reportedly heard screaming, gurgling, and sudden silence before the line went dead. Sidney later fled the gruesome scene but was arrested shortly after. She was convicted of aggravated murder and sentenced to life in prison. 20-year-old Macy Williams spent her final night the same way she'd spent most of her life, putting everyone else first. The trouble reportedly began when a friend pressured her to go out, snuck her into a bar, and pushed her to drink far more than she could safely handle. As the night went on and Macy became increasingly disoriented, she still ended up driving that friend home. Macy repeatedly asked if she could stay at the friend's house instead of trying to make it back to her own, but the request was denied. Not long after leaving the house, around 4 a.m. on September 20th, 2025, Macy's car collided head-on with a semi-truck on a highway in Knoxville. The impact was so severe that first responders said there was nothing that anyone could have done. Her death devastated her friend group, who described her as the mom friend, the one who protected everyone else before herself. Grace Van Deen, aka Chrissy, revealed that she was groomed by a producer while working on another project, an experience she said left her traumatized enough to step away from acting entirely. She described it as one of the darkest times of her life, saying Hollywood had become unsafe for her and that the incident permanently changed how she views the industry. Before Stranger Things, Brett Gelman endured years of darkness, losing his younger brother in a sudden tragedy, spiraling through severe depression, and battling suicidal thoughts while he struggled to afford rent and avoid homelessness. He says he was quietly blacklisted in Hollywood for speaking out against abusive workplaces, leaving him convinced his career would be over before it ever started. Mark Steger, the performer inside the Demogorgon suit, has said the role was one of the most physically dangerous of his career. The practical suit trapped extreme heat, restricted movement, and weighed so much that he repeatedly suffered heat exhaustion, ligament strain, and even collapsed during takes. At one point, he collapsed so fast the crew thought he'd gone into cardiac arrest. Steger said the Demogorgon required total body endurance just to survive filming days. These men were just arrested for planning something absolutely horrific. Gavin Weisenberg and Tanner Thomas of North Texas were arrested after federal investigators uncovered their deranged plan to sail to a Haitian island, massacre every man living there, and turn the women and children into sex slaves. Court documents say they weren't just fantasizing. They were buying a sailboat, gathering weapons, recruiting homeless people as soldiers, and even running crude training drills in rural Texas where they practiced ambushes and mock executions. Prosecutors say they mapped out the island on Google Earth, drafted a post-conquest government, and talked openly about executing the men, breeding the women, and raising enslaved children, all while one of them was coercing a minor into creating explicit material. The FBI foiled the plot before they could leave Texas, but the indictment describes a plan so violent and delusional, it reads like a real-life blueprint for a modern-day genocide. They now face up to life in federal prison if convicted of the conspiracy charge, and up to 30 years for the charges relating to CP. Here's a photo of what can happen when a hair dye allergy goes catastrophically wrong. This young woman suffered a violent reaction to PPD, a chemical found in most at-home dye kits, and within hours her forehead began swelling so fast it nearly doubled in size. The reaction triggered angioedema, a dangerous buildup of fluid that pooled around her eyes and scalp, warping the shape of her head and leaving one eye almost swollen shut. Doctors warn that reactions like this can escalate to throat swelling and suffocation if left untreated, and that once your body reacts to PPD, even a tiny exposure in the future can set off something even worse. In Hangzhou, China, visitors can find two iron statues permanently forced to kneel, Qin Hui and his wife Wang. They were the officials blamed for framing and executing the national hero Yu Fei in 1142. For nearly 900 years, visitors have treated the figures as if they were still alive and deserving punishment, spitting on them and smacking their heads in a ritual of public contempt. The hatred ran so deep that locals had to keep rebuilding the statues multiple times because people kept destroying them, turning these kneeling effigies into one of the longest-running acts of symbolic vengeance in history.